Hello, this is Dennis Polis. Welcome to another in the series of Open Philosophy videos. Today I will be undertaking an extremely hazardous expedition to find what some scientists believe is the most elusive of all possible evidence. Evidence for the existence of God himself. This will be a dangerous expedition in which I will have to encounter deep brush, raging beasts, and other obstacles too great for the human mind to imagine. Wish me luck. After minutes of meticulous planning and preparation, and having donned my Indiana Jones hat, I set off. It is a long trek, tiring, grueling, requiring phenomenal endurance. Still, I persist, pressing forward despite the difficulties. Eventually I come to the bush country, where we must push forward through the dense undergrowth. Eventually we come to the most dangerous part of the trek, where there are beasts that can kill men with a single blow. Finally we reach our destination, the sacred ground where the evidence for the existence of God may be found. It is favored by the existence of these mountains, the source for the evidence that we seek. Now that we have come to these sacred grounds, the real work begins, finding a suitable piece of evidence. Scanning the ground carefully, we look for that which we seek. Eventually we find it. We carefully brush aside the grit and soil that might interfere with our work. Lastly, we carefully extract our prize. Of course, careful sample preparation is critical to any scientific enterprise. Here we are washing away any contaminants that might interfere with our observations. Finally, we carefully observe and record our observations. After a time, we find exactly the behavior that we seek. Now we have that evidence which so many claimed that we could not find, the critical evidence for the existence of God. Now that you've seen the evidence for the existence of God, you probably have no idea why it is the evidence. That's the problem with evidence. Unless we know how to interpret it, it does no good whatsoever. Imagine that you're a crime scene investigator in 1950. You're called to the scene of a murder. There's blood everywhere. Part of that blood comes from the perpetrator. Yet you have no idea that that blood contains DNA which will identify the murderer. That's the problem. Unless you know how to use the evidence, it does you no good whatsoever. So when atheists say that there's no evidence for the existence of God, it doesn't really say anything other than that they don't know how to use the evidence. Let's take a look at this rock. What is it evidence for? Well, it's evidence for a great many things. First of all, it's evidence for the geological processes which brought it to where I found it. It was washed down from the mountains, which you saw in the background. The rock is also evidence for the nucleosynthesis in the early universe. The elements which make up the rock would be impossible if it were not for certain stellar processes which created them. The rock could also contain isotopes, the ratios of which would tell us something about the age of the Earth. The rock is evidence for a great deal, but unless we know how to interpret the evidence, we have no idea what it's trying to tell us. And one of the things that it's trying to tell us is that God exists. Let's see how that works. You recall observing the rock. What did it do? Well, it didn't appear to be doing anything, but actually it did something very important which passes unnoticed. It persisted or continued in being. It is a quite sensible question to ask why it persisted and did not go poof. If we ask a physicist, we will be told that electron interactions kept it together and that the individual atoms were kept in being by conservation laws such as the conservation of mass energy, baryon number, lepton number, electron number, and so on. Let's examine that answer. First of all, we explain things by the immaterial laws of nature, and not by anything material. Secondly, the laws are immanent, operating in matter, and transcendent, depending on no single instance or kind of matter. Third, the laws explain things here and now because they act here and now. It would be no good for the law of conservation of energy, for example, to be operating in the past and not when we were observing the stone. If it didn't operate when we were observing the stone, it couldn't keep the stone in being. Fourth, the conservation laws we use to explain things are aspects of reality, not fictions. We discover them by observing reality. We don't make them up. Thus, they exist in reality. If they did not, they would not be able to explain why the stone didn't go poof in reality. We need to be careful to distinguish the laws of physics, which are descriptions of reality, from the laws of nature, which actually operate in reality. The final thing that we should notice is that science requires explanations not just for changes, but for constancy. Conservation laws, such as that of mass energy, baryon number, electric charge, momentum, and so on, are explanations of why things do not change. Now that we understand that even unchanging things require explanations, let us ask why the laws of nature do not change. Just as the constancy of mass energy or of electric charge requires a conservation law to explain it, so the constancy of the laws themselves requires another law to explain them. Let us call it a meta-conservation law. If we iterate, we get a meta-meta-conservation law, and then a meta-meta-meta-conservation law, and so on. Clearly, the strategy of piling one meta on top of another gets us nowhere. We don't get any closer to explaining why the laws of nature remain constant. The reason we needed the meta in the first place is that the law of conservation of mass energy, for example, conserves mass energy and not a law. We need a law which conserves laws. But if it doesn't conserve itself, then it leads to another meta law, and so on. So what we actually need is a law which conserves other laws and also conserves itself. Something which keeps the laws of nature in operation and also conserves itself in being fits the description of what we call God. This is how the persistence of the stone leads us through the laws of nature to the existence of God.